Following the end of the Second World War, a number of war crimes trials were held to bring the perpetrators of crimes against humanity and atrocities to justice. Some of the greatest and largest scale crimes were committed by the Einsatzgruppen, a number of Nazi death squads that followed the Wehrmacht and committed large-scale genocide. Under the guise of military advancement, they murdered millions, and some of the largest massacres saw dozens of thousands executed each day. After the end of the conflict, 24 senior leaders of the Einsatzgruppen were brought to trial, and 14 death sentences were handed out for the organised mass murder. Almost all of the people killed by the group were civilians and innocent people. So join us today as we look at the executions of the Einsatzgruppen Trial, and remember to support our channel. Please make sure to subscribe. The Einsatzgruppen were responsible for mass murder that took place during World War II, and the majority of their crimes were carried out by gunshot. They were overseen by Reichsfuhrer SS Heinrich Himmler, and specifically SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich, and operated within German-occupied territory. They were initially used to help in the Action T4 euthanasia programme, where they helped to organise the mass killing of individuals with physical and mental disabilities. Thousands were killed in the programme, many being shot by the Einsatzgruppen before the gas chambers were later used. Even before World War II began, they were being used to exterminate, but after the invasion of Poland, they were mobilised to follow the Wehrmacht after they made advancements into different lands. They were organised into different elements, and 4,000 soldiers were used in Poland to massacre members of the Polish leadership, along with the clergy, teachers, members of the nobility, and others. The Einsatzgruppen carried out many of the massacres, but within a few months, 65,000 civilians had been murdered. There were 7 different Einsatzgruppens, staffed with 500 men, who worked within Poland, but they were under the command of the army, but Heydrich was the one who gave the orders. Hitler even gave them all the equipment they needed to carry out the war crimes, but before the invasion of the Soviet Union, Hitler stated that criminal acts against civilians during the operation would not be prosecuted. This gave the Einsatzgruppen and Wehrmacht excuse to shoot anyone who they wished to, and a free license to kill as many people as possible. Heydrich later ordered the Einsatzgruppen to also shoot civilians and Jews, and the men who completed the evil job were plucked from the Gestapo, SD and Waffen-SS. Each death squad followed an assigned army group, and they would then target as many civilians as possible. Heydrich in July 1941 then stated that all Jews were to be seen as partisans, and that all male Jews between 15 and 45 years old should be shot, and he also said POWs should be executed too. The targets also included women and children, but disturbingly the high-ranking members of the SS saw the killing process as too slow. The way that the Einsatzgruppen carried out the massacres was that after the advancements from the army, they would go in and round up victims inside of towns, cities and villages, and then order them to go to a destination. This was usually found on land outside of the settlement, but the victims were then forced to dig their own graves, huge pits on the outskirts of their homes. They were stripped of all their valuables and were then driven into the pit. Then the Einsatzgruppen, who were usually stood on the edge of the pit, fired at the victims, and the bodies piled up. Families were often forced to witness their loved ones being shot before they were also driven into the pit and were executed on the corpses of those who were stood there moments before. The accounts of the massacres reached Jews, and a number managed to flee, but there were huge war crimes carried out in a matter of days. The Babi Yar massacre took place between the 29th and 30th of September 1941 on the outskirts of Kiev. Jews had been told to report to a street corner, and if they did not attend, they would be killed. The huge numbers gathered, and they were forced to march 2 miles out of the city centre and were led into an open area. They were forced to strip before being driven into a ravine, and then were told to lie down on top of other bodies before they were shot dead by the Einsatzgruppen. Over the 2 days, 33,000 people were killed in this way, and then the group tried to cover up the crimes. Also, the Rumbula massacre occurred in a similar way, with 25,000 people being killed in just a matter of days inside of Latvia. The Einsatzgruppen went where it was needed, being called to different parts of occupied lands to do nothing but execute dozens of civilians. Heinrich Himmler later deemed the killing process to be too costly and slow, and later the killing method was switched to gassing, using concentration camps following the Wannsee Conference. But after the end of the Second World War, a number of trials did take place, in which the aim was to bring the main Einsatzgruppen organisers to justice. There were thousands who were involved in the killing, but only a very few were ever brought to trial. The Einsatzgruppen Trial was the 9th of 12 war crimes trials held in Nuremberg after the Second World War came to an end, and they took place at the Palace of Justice. All of the 24 brought to trial were commanders of the Einsatzgruppen units, and they were charged with crimes against humanity, on war crimes, and also being members of the SS, SD or Gestapo. It was said by the tribunal that, in this case the defendants are not simply accused of planning or directing wholesale killings through channels. They are not charged with sitting in an office hundreds of thousands of miles away from the slaughter. It is asserted with particularity that these men were in the field actively superintending, controlling, directing, and taking an active part in the bloody harvest. All of the defendants were charged with the 3 different counts, and all of them pleaded not guilty. Some of the commanding officers brought to trial were Otto Erlendorf, Heinz Jost, Erich Naumann, Otto Rausch, Erwin Schultz, and Paul Blobel. Evidence was put forward that was truly condemning, with witnesses who somehow managed to survive the massacres telling of the brutality and organised mass killing. It was said of those crimes that the facts are so beyond the experience of normal man and the range of man-made phenomena that only the most complete judicial inquiry and the most exhaustive trial could verify and confirm them. Although the principal accusation is murder, the charge of purposeful homicide in this case reaches such fantastic proportions and surpasses such credible limits that believability must be bolstered with assurance 100 times repeated. A crime of such unprecedented brutality and of such inconceivable savagery that the mind rebels against its own thought image and the imagination staggers in the contemplation of a human degradation beyond the power of language to adequately portray. The numbers of deaths resulting from the activities with which these defendants have been connected and which the prosecution has set at 1 million is an abstract number. One cannot grasp the full cumulative terror of murder 1 million times repeated. It is only when this grotesque total is broken down into units capable of mental assimilation that one can understand the monstrousness of things we are in this trial contemplating. One must visualise not 1 million people, but only 10 persons, men, women and children, perhaps all one family, falling before the executioner's guns. If 1 million is divided by 10, this scene must happen 100,000 times. And as one visualises the repetitive horror, one begins to understand the meaning of the prosecution's words. It is with sorrow and with hope that we here disclose the deliberate slaughter of more than 1 million innocent and defenceless men, women and children. All of those brought to trial were found guilty, and there were 14 death sentences confirmed by the judges. But surprisingly, only 4 of these were ever carried out, with the other sentences being commuted to time in prison. Those who were killed were Otto Erlendorf, Erich Naumann, Paul Blobel and Werner Braun. They were all taken to Landsberg prison after their sentence to await their executions. The 4 men were kept in the condemned cells at Landsberg, which was the site where hundreds of Nazi war criminals were executed by the US Army after the Second World War. A gallows had been created inside of the courtyard of Landsberg prison, and this saw regular action after the conflict to administer some justice to those war criminals. On the 7th of June 1951, the 4 who were condemned to death were led out one by one to the courtyard and the gallows. They were flanked by guards who accompanied them, along with a priest who stayed with them until their final moments. The guards led them to the gallows before identity was confirmed, and then they were led up the stairs of the gallows. On the scaffold stood the executioner, the priest and other guards, who then handed the men over to the executioner. He asked for any final words, and these were recorded, before he placed a black hood over each of their heads, and then the noose was also placed over their head. Following this, the condemned was shuffled over the trap door, and within seconds the lever was pulled, releasing it, and the condemned each plunged to their deaths, being killed by the drop. For the fact the Einsatzgruppen killed its estimated around 2 million civilians and people, only 4 people were executed for their roles in the killing squad. It's a rather shocking number compared to the amount massacred by the death squads. Once again, thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.